Good morning, or to some of you, good afternoon, and maybe even good evening. So, welcome to this training session. My name is Dash Davidson. I'm a sports data analyst here at Tableau. And today we will be talking about 7 different types of data story types. Or as I like to think about it, how to tease stories out of your data. And before we get going, I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Jade Levin, who is out of our Paris office. I'm here in Seattle at Tableau headquarters, and Jade can help out with any questions you may have in the chat box. So this session will run, approximately 45 minutes. And I'll be talking for most of that, running through a kind of thought starter presentation. But if you have questions throughout any of that, just type them into the chat box and Jade will be happy to assist you there. And at the end, I will leave some time for questions should anyone want to discuss anything on the actual call. And you've noticed that you are all actually on mute right now. And that's not because I don't want to hear from you, but it's just so we can have an uninterrupted presentation, and then you can just type your questions in the chat box. So please don't feel discouraged from asking questions, just type them in, and either myself or Jade will be happy to get to them. All right, so a general overview of what we'll be talking about today. So we've all seen data sets, and we've all faced the task of trying to understand or analyze a new data set. So in our experience here at Tableau, it's often difficult to do that first step. So how do you kind of get into a data set? Maybe it's a very large data set, maybe it's a very small data set. How do you get inside it and start to really ask the important questions which could ultimately lead to your successful analysis of that data set? So we often think about this as how can you interact with this data set? How can you bring it to life? How can you ask questions or use techniques that can really get you inside that data set and start to understand it? So with this presentation, we're going to look at 7 different techniques that in general can be used to help you analyze your data. So how to bring that story out of your data. And ultimately that's the goal of Tableau. It's to visualize and bring static data to life. So before we get started, let's look at a little motivation from a master storyteller himself. So we're going to watch about 1.5 minutes of this clip, and this is from the 1980s, and you can see already how people are starting to think about how to visualize stories.
Well, there's no reason why the simple shapes of stories can't be fed into computers. They are beautiful shapes. This is the GI axis, good fortune, ill fortune. Sickness and poverty down here, wealth and boisterous good health up there. Here's the very middle. Now, this is the BE axis. B stands for beginning. E stands for electricity. Now, this is an exercise in relativity, really. The shape of the curves matters and not their origins. So we'll start a little above average. Is why get a depressing person? We'll start. The whole thing, we call this story Man in Hole, but it needn't be about a man, and it needn't be about somebody getting into a hole. But it's just a good way to remember. Somebody gets into trouble, gets out of it again. People love that story. They never get sick of it. All right, not copyrighted. Another story is also a beautiful curve and easily fed into a computer called Boy Gets Girl, but it needn't be that. Just a way to remember it. Start on an average day, average person, not expecting anything to happen a day like any other. finds something wonderful, just loves it. Oh, God damn it. Got it back again.
All right, so that was master storyteller himself, Kurt Vonnegut. And as you can see, what Kurt Vonnegut there is saying is there are arcs to stories. There are graphical representations of stories. So we thought here at Tableau we could kind of do the opposite. So we could take data and apply storytelling techniques to data sets. And so now as we jump over to Tableau, let me just pull this over here. We will see how you can use these techniques, 7 very simple techniques, to interact with any sort of data set. So the data set that we'll be using here in this demonstration is a very simple one. And it's the very popular Freedom House, Freedom of the Press ratings data set. So if we look closely at this, what's going on here is we have country in our first column here in column A, region of the world in column B, year that the score was computed, and then these 3 different score factors. So we have a legal score, a political score, and an economic score. And then all 3 of those scores are combined, just simply added together to make your total score. And then based on the number of that total score, we have 3 different ratings. Not free, as you can see here with Afghanistan, partly free, as you can see here with Albania, or free, as you can see here with Andorra. And if we look closely, we can see that lower scores are better. So the free score category is anything that's lower than, I believe, 40. So it's a very simple data set here. We have 7 columns, and I think we have all of 250 rows. So the techniques I'm going to show can even be used on this very simple data set. So imagine if you have a complicated kind of work data set or business data set or analytics data set, and just think of the types of analysis you can do on this. All right, so this is the data set we're using, and what this data set is describing is Freedom House is a nonprofit, and so they'll go in and classify each country based on these 3 metrics, based on how free the press is in that country. So how independent and non-fettered the press is, so newspapers, magazines, television, all sorts of news. And based on how they're scored on these 3 metrics, each country is classified as having not free press, partly free press, or free press. So it's a proxy of kind of how you can look at the world politically. All right. So now back over to Tableau, and we can run through these 7 basic plots or data story types that we think can help you get in and start analyzing your data. Hang on, sorry, okay. So the 7 basic plots, this here is from literature. So this is something you'll learn in Literature 101 classes. So there's Overcoming the Monster, Rags to Riches, The Quest, Voyage and Return, Comedy, Tragedy, and Rebirth. And that's actually very similar to some of the things that Kurt Vonnegut was saying. So this is the quintessential 7 different basic plots of literature. So the question is, if that's for literature, what can we do with data storytelling? So this is obviously a newer field than literature itself. So what is a data story anyway? That's our first kind of task. And so in order to define this, sometimes you need to make definitions. And so this is from a paper by 2 Stanford professors back in 2010. So what is a data story? And it's though data visualization often evokes comparisons to storytelling, the relationship between the two is rarely articulated clearly. And I would argue that this was in 2010 when this whole field was more nascent. So now, 7 years later, when there's been a significant amount of work by people like yourselves in the data visualization community, that this relationship is far clearer, and people are much better at articulating that relationship clearly. So the proposal we'll use today is that a quantitative visual narrative, or a series of facts shown linearly, shown in a storytelling fashion through data visualization. So there's no reason you can't use data as the basis for a story. And that's kind of our fundamental hypothesis that we'll be testing here. And on Tableau Public, we have this great feature called story points. And if you look closely here, that's what all these little visualizations are using. And it's a way you can click through, and we'll see further examples so you don't have to hurt your eyes looking at this. But you can kind of click through different slides of a live data visualization, making it very easy to get a linear story relationship in a live data visualization. So this is a great feature for allowing people to tell stories with data. Okay, so the 7 data story types that we'll be discussing in the next 20 minutes to half an hour are here on your screen. So first we'll be looking at change over time, then drill down, then the opposite of drill down, zoom out, then contrast, intersections, probably my favorite one, then factors, and finally, everyone's favorite, outliers. All right, and of course, we'll be using this Freedom House, Freedom of the Press data set that we already looked at. And if you're interested in sources, you can just Google Freedom House, but it's available here, freedomhouse.org. Okay, change over time. So this is a very straightforward example. So simply using time as your comparative axis. So in this example here, using our Freedom House data set, and this is our story points interface. So as we'll see, we can click from this view to this view to this view, and in a very guided fashion, which is very nice. But so we're telling a story here, and the crux of our story is change over time. So here at the beginning of the millennium, there were 75 free countries. And how do we get that? We can circle over this, and here's 2001, and we can see there were 75 countries here on our y-axis. Then this middle band here is partly free, and then not free up there on the top. Now, if we click through and see, so this will zoom forward, here's our year filter, so it's currently 2001 to 2004. See what happens when we click the second slide. So now we see that we zoomed ahead not just 2001 to 2004 here on our filter, but 2001 to 2013. And we can see this trend that this blue slice is getting relatively narrower, whereas the red slice is also getting, I don't know, maybe staying pretty similar, but this gray slice in the middle representing partly free countries is expanding. So whereas before we started with 75 free countries in 2001, by 2013 we now have 63. And now if we isolate just our free countries, so now instead of filtering to all of our different categories, we're only looking at free countries. And we can see this kind of disturbing declining trend. So if we go back, the only thing we're changing here is our filter here for year. So we can tease a story out of this data set just by looking at change over time. And in fact, it's a very impactful story in that our freest countries, so the best countries for freedom of the press, is considerably declining. And if you're into statistics, that is the trend line itself. But if you extrapolate this further over time, that does not bode well for the ongoing independence of the press in the world, which is alarming for democracy. So that is our first technique, change over time. And there's some really excellent examples of this in the news. So this is probably one of our most famous Tableau Public vizzes of all time. This was created by a reporter named John Schoen at CNBC in New York. And what he wanted to visualize was, let me actually get this in presentation mode here, sorry about that. What he wanted to visualize was how the Dow Industrial Average Stock Market Index changed over time. Very simple story, and instead of the Freedom House data set, he's using the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So what he's allowed us to do up here is simply click through the decades, so take a trip down time travel. And so as we'll see, each axis, so this is the years going up over time, and you can see how in each decade the indice either increased or decreased. So you can really get a picture of the entire economic history of the 20th century history of the United States in this one visualization. Swinging 60s, great inflation in the 70s, really choppy. The late 70s, I don't know if anyone remembers that. Merger mania in the 80s, stuff starting to accelerate. Check out the 90s. The massive tech boom, where also notice these axes on the left. Here in the 60s, so this is now $4 billion, whereas in the 60s, it's only up to 180 million. So stuff is really accelerating. And of course, when you have that type of boom, the 2000s, the Great Recession, and then the present recovery. And so this is using that exact same change over time technique. And just one technique on one data set. And this is one of the most viewed Tableau Public visualizations of all time, with far over 1 million views by CNBC, a world-class news outlet. Okay, our second type, drill down. So now we're looking at the same data set, but on a map. And we're looking at that one score for each country, and it's showing up as a little blue dot here on the map. So here are free countries in blue, not free countries in red, and then our partly free countries in gray. And whatever country you live in, you can just quickly pick out and see very easily what their score is. And here are those same countries on a chart. Okay, so we're looking at the entire world here. This is a very macro level, high level view. So this might be the first type of view you can create when you're first trying to just see what this data is even showing you. Okay, I just create a map, I drop my rating metric on color, and here we have our world map with our 3 different colors. And we see, okay, the world is roughly divided into thirds. So 36% are free, 30% are partly free, and 33% are not free. And if we notice here, our region is set to all. So now let's drill down a little bit. Let's drill down into Asia. So now instead of our region being all, we've selected just Asia, and now our map is focused on Asia, and our bar chart here is only showing Asian countries. And importantly, our percentages have updated. So now of Asia, more than half of the continent, 60%, is characterized as not free, whereas only 10% is free. So whereas in the world it was roughly thirds, Asia has a problem in that there is not very free press in the continent. And of all the countries in Asia, North Korea here, at the top of our bar chart, has the worst score. so the least free press. So this is how you can use drill down to go from a very high-level view to a very focused view. And what's the story here in North Korea? I mean, if anyone's been paying attention to the news lately, or not even lately really, but it's very well known that North Korea has a very not free press. In fact, they made a movie about it. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but it's where James Franco and Seth Rogen go to North Korea. And bad things happen. I wouldn't really recommend the movie, but it's so well known that North Korea is so not free for the press that there was a Hollywood movie about it. So that's how you can use drill down to go from a high-level view to a very focused view, and then confine your story that way. So type 3 zoom out is going to be very similar to drill down. So we're just flipping the script with our Asia example. So instead of taking North Korea, which had our poorest score, Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden are the 3 most free countries in the world. And here they are in this tiny little Scandinavian corridor. So now instead of starting at the macro level, we're starting at the micro level. We're starting with just Europe. And so now if we zoom out from just Norway, Sweden, and the Netherlands to the entire continent of Europe, we see that over 2 and 3 European countries are categorized as free, with just these 4 here, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and Turkey, not free. Also Russia. And so compare that to Asia. Why is that a different story? Well, if you know political history, you might be able to get some insight there, but imagine this is a sales data set. So why is my European sales so much stronger than our Asian sales? Those are important questions that you can unearth through using these techniques. And if we further zoom out, globally, just as we learned, just over 1 in 3 countries are categorized as free. So something special is going on here in Europe. So again, using that sales example, why are our sales in Europe so much stronger than the rest of the world? What are we doing there that we're not doing elsewhere? What have we done there that we're not doing elsewhere? This is how you can go from data to insight, and from insight to action. And that's the goal of Tableau, just by using these very simple zoom out and drill down techniques. All right, type 4, contrast. This is a very powerful technique. So the example here is that the 10 countries with the best scores in the entire world are all in Europe. And here they are. Norway, Sweden, Netherlands, as you saw, were number 1. And all 10 of them are clustered here in Western Europe. Contrast that with the 10 countries with the worst score are in 5 different regions of the world. So we have North Korea as our lowest score, and here are the rest of the bottom 10. So in terms of contrast, this is a story just waiting to be explored. Why is it that our 10 best sales accounts are all clustered in a very small region, whereas our 10 worst ones are all spread out? Is it because we have a really stellar salesperson in Western Europe? How can we impart that knowledge to our distributed sales reps across the entire world? Here is a very powerful example of that contrast technique being used in the press by data journalist Inga Ting at the Sydney Morning Herald. So let me take you back to 2013 when there was a prior refugee crisis going on in Australia. In that there were a lot of refugees coming to Australia, and there was backlash amongst the Australian citizens. So what Inga Ting was able to do was she was able to classify and put data behind this situation. And so she was able to show in this one visualization that in a per capita sense, Australia was not housing really very many refugees at all. So let's see how she did that. So each of these countries is sized by how many refugees they hosted. You can see that right there. So Pakistan hosted the most refugees, 1.6 million. There's Iraq with 250,000. And there's Australia in orange. So they hosted 35,000, and that's your rank out of your 187 countries, 48. Now, if we switch this metric to as a share of population, Lebanon is now number 1. And Australia is 62nd out of 187, even smaller. And now measured against economic wealth, so as a share of GDP, where is Australia? It's all the way down here, rank of 74. So what she was able to do with this is contrast the public opinion that, oh, woe is us, we're hosting so many refugees here in Australia. And by using data to actually back it up and explain and show that, in fact, Australia was not hosting any more refugees than really any other country. And that's using data to inform public opinion. And that's, of course, as we all know, is one of the most impactful things that data can do. It can take opinion and prejudice and either prove it or disprove it based on facts. So that is the burden that we all need to strive to. Inga Ting, one of the best data journalists in the world. Type 5, intersections. Intersections, whenever you see things changing or crossing paths, be this in sports, be this in testing, be this in Freedom House, Freedom of the Press scores, there's always a story there. And this often can be some of our most exciting stories, in sports particularly, when the rival passes its other rival, when the team in second place passes the team in first place. There's always a story when an intersection happens. Why? Why is this happening? Why is one sinking? Why is one rising? And let's see this play out in our Freedom House scores. So through 2005, partly free countries were the least common with 54, 67 not free, 73 free countries. Zoom ahead to 2009, and now we see that not free countries have been passed by partly free. So that means more countries are kind of in this middle area than in either extreme. Now, if we fast forward 2 more years to 2011, now partly free countries is the most common group in the world, with 72 countries compared to 66 for free and 59 for not free. Now, 1 more year, 2013, we see that in 2012, not free countries passed free countries. And so now if we look at the entire scope of our 12 years of this data, the ranking has completely swapped. So in 2001, we had free, then not free, then partly free. And now in 2013, we have partly free, not free, and free. And we have these 2 moments of intersection here, or 3 actually, in the last 7 years. So if anyone has been paying attention to kind of geopolitics over the last 15 years, you might be able to explain why this is happening. And my hypothesis would be that the destabilization of the Middle East led to by the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan by the US in the early 2000s, right around here, precipitated this drop in free countries, rise in partly free, and rise in not free. So, I mean, of course, that's a hypothesis. You need to further prove that. But that is what these intersections can help you find out. And they're just moments where you have to ask yourself, why is this happening? Why is not free countries rising and free countries are falling. So disturbing trend, how can we reverse it, and why is this happening? Again, going back to that sales example, why are certain regions falling, why are certain regions rising, and what happens in inflection points, what happens in points of intersection? Always a very important point to look at. Type 6, factors. So now we're going to look at those 3 factors that make up the overall score for each country. And so if we're looking at just average score of each country over time, we'll see that on average, the score is getting slightly worse. From 45.3, then there's a little dip, and remember, higher scores are worse. Now in 2013, we're up significantly from 45 to 47. Now remember that this total score is made up of 3 separate factors. So we have legal in blue, economic in green, and political in orange. And so the average score of each factor may not be changing as much as the overall score of the total. We can see that economic, for example, started at 14.4 and ended at 14.4. And now if we look at each trend individually, we can see that economic here in green and legal in blue are essentially staying flat. Okay, maybe legal is rising a little bit, but political pressures is significantly rising from 17 to 19. So now by doing a quick factor analysis, you can see that even though the total scores of the countries have gone up, as we've seen throughout this demonstration, the factor that is contributing most to that is political pressures. And again, going back to that kind of hypothesis, this could be another further data point proving that hypothesis. So destabilization of an entire region, political destabilization caused by invasions could be affecting these scores, more so than any legal or economic changes that have happened over the last 15 years. So if we're trying to identify what is causing freedom of the press around the world to become less free, with a factor analysis like this one, we can identify that it's due to political reasons. So let's just back up for a second and pause and think about what we're learning here, just so I don't lose you. These are a lot of examples, I understand that. These are techniques you can use on a new data set to try to understand what's going on. And in each of these examples, we're doing that. We're imagining that we're blind and brand new to a data set, and maybe it's as simple as this Freedom House scores one, or maybe it's a decent bit more complicated. But these are universal techniques, just like those 7 basic narrative plots we looked at, rags to riches, overcoming the monster, the quest, just like Kurt Vonnegut was talking about. They're universal techniques that can help us analyze any single data set. So that's why these are important. All right, our 7th type, outliers. This is often kind of the most obvious, painfully obvious example, so I saved it for last, of course. All right, so what we're looking at here is each one of these dots is a country, and these are their scores. So there is North Korea, and down here is our 3 Scandinavian countries, Norway, Netherlands, and Sweden. And what we've done is create a box and whisker plot. So this shows distribution. And anything bounded by the top and bottom whiskers means they lie within the normal distribution. So when we're looking at the whole world, every country is within the normal distribution of the whole world. However, as soon as we break that global view down by regions, we can see there are 3 what we would call negative outliers within certain of our regions. So the first most obvious one in Oceania here, so here are countries in New Zealand, Micronesia, Australia, Vanuatu, Nauru, and then all the way up here, and these are all normally distributed in a very tight range, and all the way up here we have Fiji. So we can see that's clearly very different from its neighbors. So I don't know enough about Fiji to know why that is, but for Fiji audience, that would be huge news. And so you'd have to say, why? What are we doing that our neighbors are not? Why is our score 54 when the median score for our entire region is 28, almost double? Likewise, in Europe, there are more countries, so our distribution is slightly wider, but yet still every country, save for these 2, lie within the normal distribution: Russia and Belarus. And obviously, we all know that Russia is a very particular political environment. Belarus is less obvious to me, and yet their score is one of the worst in the entire world. So why are these so different from their European neighbors? There are stories there. I wish I knew more about it to answer them. And finally, there's also one positive outlier. So one country that scores significantly better than the rest of its region, and that's Israel in the Middle East. So Israel's score is significantly better than all of its neighbors. Why is that? Again, we could probably understand this in the scope of history and politics, but the important thing is that this technique can point you to those stories, can lead you to that next question. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do with Tableau. Always ask the next question of your data set. Okay, so those were our 7 different data story types. We went over change over time, drill down, zoom out, contrast, intersections, factors, and outliers. And all of these examples were used with a very simple 8-column data set. So what I would like to leave you with is the motivation that, just as Kurt Vonnegut was saying, there's always a story. It doesn't matter what you're looking at. It doesn't matter how boring the data might seem. It doesn't matter how interesting the data might seem. There's always a story in it. And it is our job as data analysts, as stewards of data, as data evangelists, to communicate those stories. But in order to communicate them, we need to first find them. And we've all been there where you're looking at a very large data set that seems really overwhelming and you don't know where to start. Well, these techniques are how you can start. So start with a drill down. Start with change over time. Next time you're drawing a blank, look for intersections and then go from there. These are ways in. So they're not the most complicated techniques. In fact, they're very simple. But we believe that by applying them to any data set, you will begin to understand it. And then from there, you can ask more informed questions and do more in-depth analysis. And by using the story points tool, as we've seen throughout, this is story points again, you can guide others through your exploratory process. And we found that this can be a very impactful way to share your data discoveries with others. All right, so that is it for the presentation. Thank you very much. And I will now see if we have any questions on the line. We have about 5 minutes left.